Dear Church, from the time we arrived just over a year ago, I've had a desire to write a series of pastoral letters to our church community. There's so much we have experienced as a church over the last few years, and there's something about a letter that creates space for reflection and connection that can be hard to come by. I'll clumsily move between I and we throughout these letters as I relate stories from my perspective, but also try to express what's in mine and Danny's hearts together, as well as the efforts and perspective of a wonderful team. My hope in writing this letter, and those which are to follow, is to be able to shepherd us as a congregation, mindful of the failings and achievements of the past, and looking forward having learned from it all. There's a lot to learn from our challenges and shortcomings as a church, as well as the challenges that we have faced as a broader society and as individuals. Danny and I, along with our team, also share an awareness of the powerful ways in which God has used us as a community to draw people to His love, and that there is a unique part that we play as a church in the greater body of Christ. I'm confident that some of what has looked like challenge or opposition will one day become evident as God's guidance and provision, as the Father in His mercy, giving us the opportunity to change and grow, that we might continue to bear fruit. When Danny and I were first approached to come to New York City and lead our church on the East Coast, it seemed to have come out of the blue. We were pastoring a Hillsong church in Perth, Western Australia, that we had planted alongside a great team. From the people to the sense of home to the city itself, which is nothing short of gorgeous. We absolutely loved our time there. We also had the opportunity to be involved with planting our church in parts of Asia, and that was where we had thought we would sow at least the next 10 years of our lives, perhaps even moving to live in Asia with our family. When I received the phone call to ask whether we would consider moving to NYC and become part of Hillsong East Coast, I knew it would be a significant change of course, a huge step into the unknown for us and our young family. I also knew we needed to stay open to how we believed God might be leading us and do our best to respond in ways that continued to put our trust in Him. Danny and I had always had the perspective that if we were needed anywhere in the world, we would go. We had gotten the call in the middle of a young adults retreat, and late into the night when the session was over and we'd finished preparing for the next day, we stopped to talk. I'll never forget the look in Danny's eyes late that night as we talked about what we'd been asked. There were tears in those eyes and down her cheeks, and she simply but confidently said, "We have to go. We have to be there for the people." And that was it. The biggest decision of our lives had also been the quickest. In February of this year, we received the news that Pastor Brian had resigned amidst a maelstrom of accusations. Given what had taken place with leadership here on the East Coast, it was an even more bitter blow. It was a compounded loss and heartbreak on heartbreak. We gathered together with some of the church leaders at Mark and Robin's house in New Jersey to process. We talked about the days ahead, the way forward, and what we hoped for our church community here. We looked around the room full of people we were coming to know and who we already loved. There were so many questions from every part of that room, and underneath some of those questions was a deeper question: are you going to stay? Over the coming weeks, I got asked that same question in a number of different ways. I'd even sent an email with the subject line, "We love you, church," which some had seen and thought to mean that Danny and I were leaving. It was meant to be an encouragement that we did love our church, and we wanted everyone to hear that in the midst of what we knew were painful times. Ultimately, we had come for people, and those people were still here. So back to that living room in New Jersey. We shared and talked for a while, but what stood out to me most that night, and that I still remember, came towards the end while Mark was speaking. He said that even though there was so much challenge, he felt like he was born for this, born for days of challenge when things needed to be rebuilt and reformed and brought out of the ground. And as he talked, a fire within me was being fanned. Ever since becoming a pastor, I had felt drawn to be involved where things seemed tough, where seeking wisdom and summoning courage was the order of the day. I resonated with what Mark said. I too was born for this time, these people, this hope-finding adventure. Feeling called to it and loving the people of our church was a great start, but I also knew I had gone past the limits of my existing capacity. Whatever emotional capacity I had to stand in the midst of challenge was proving insufficient for this new task, along with all the ways I had learned to rest and to be refreshed. In the years we lived in Perth, I had become an open water swimmer, albeit a slow one, and I now missed the camaraderie of training, the freedom of ocean swims, and the joy of completing a challenge. And yes, there are sharks in Australia, But honestly, I was usually more worried about hypothermia or swimming into stingers, invisible jellyfish with painful tentacles. And yes, also for those wondering, I still want to swim the Hudson River. I needed now to find new ways to rest and rejuvenate. I still do. But I also needed to grow in the practices needed to flourish in emotional and spiritual health. Although emotional health is part of our spiritual health, it is all spiritual. Thankfully, Drew Hyun, a pastor in New York City, had reached out and welcomed us and said if we needed anything, he was there to help. True to his word, Drew introduced us to others, prayed for us and with us, as many did, and also connected us with a course called Emotionally Healthy Relationships, or EHR. We jumped into the course and had the privilege of being in a group with Jerry Scazzero, who, along with her husband Pete, had put together much of the material. It was a joy to get to know Pete and Jerry, and it was a meeting laced with the kind of coincidences that God seems to love to orchestrate. Pete and Jerry have 4 daughters, like us, and one of their daughters had gotten married and was living in Perth in Australia. What are the chances? It became one of the highlights of our first few months and one of the most significant things that helped us not just survive a difficult season, but grow in the midst of it. As difficult as any international move can be, and combined with the challenges we faced as a church, I can honestly say that I believe I'm better for this last season. I've grown. I feel like I'm a better husband, a more understanding father. Hopefully my kids share this perspective. And a more well-differentiated leader. More on this in a future letter. The EHR course started to introduce us to new ways of relating in our marriage and family, as well as to help me better process what was going on internally. I'd never been big on talking or thinking about my feelings. I don't know that I'd ever seen a man model anything emotional in a significant way outside of anger. Now I was sitting in a course on emotional health, and one of the exercises was to be able to identify and articulate what emotions I was feeling. I was lost for words. I literally didn't have a vocabulary at hand to describe anything like that. I had to turn to the appendix with a list of emotions just so I could consider which ones might apply to me. One of the most powerful moments in that course was seeing another man, husband, father, and pastor, speak to his wife about what was going on within him in the midst of a heart-wrenching situation and how he felt about it. I was in tears at his tears and his knowledge of himself. And it was changing me. In a conversation with Pete Scazzero, he challenged me to build back in ways that aligned with the charism or gift of God on our church. And there is certainly something unique and profound that we bring to the body of Christ here in the Northeast and, I believe, globally. There has been a lot in our church over the years that has been good. We've been a part of seeing God do something absolutely remarkable here in the Northeast, where hundreds of thousands of people have made decisions for Christ in our services. In Perth, where Danny and I pastored, the new pastors are Andy and Lauren's own powerful story includes coming back to Christ at our church in New York City. What are the chances? So despite every challenge of the last season, we don't want to neglect what God has placed on our church. There is a grace on our church to reach a new generation and to reach people in urban centers, a grace for corporate worship and welcome home and calling out the call of God on people's lives and seeing the Spirit move and people be empowered. We are committed to the ways in which we take those good gifts into the future and are going to articulate some of that in these letters to come. I want to begin, however, by looking at what needs addressing in the foundations. What else do we need to have in place to ensure that as we move forward, we are building in ways that are stronger? What needs to be present in the seedbed as we grow and bear new fruit? As we have considered this, we have drawn on a few key questions. What represents the best of who we have been till now? What represents the best of who we were in our origin story right back when church started? And what do we need to draw on from the broader church that we have neglected and or need to engage with in fresh ways? In considering the last of those questions, I believe that we need to be strengthened by engaging in some of the spiritual practices that have underpinned the life of individuals and church communities for hundreds and even thousands of years. This is the work of formation. The formation that creates lasting change in the way we relate to God, understand ourselves, love others, and see the world. The formation that empowers us as a community to be a part of the continued work of Christ in the world. I think we have often had a somewhat dichotomous view of some of these practices of spiritual formation. We can think we are this type of church, and so we just don't do those kinds of things. We have too easily eschewed what is birthed within different church traditions, when in reality there is a lot of rich beauty and thinking and experience in some ancient Christian practices. Some of these began in the church before there was any idea of different streams of Christianity. They are our common heritage. A word used frequently in churches for what I am talking about here is discipleship. For us as a church, this has tended to be predominantly through corporate gatherings and through the relationships built and community formed as leaders volunteer to facilitate small groups where people share meals and talk about the word and pray. This relational aspect of discipleship is important and is seen in what it meant for disciples in the first century to follow a rabbi. Disciples would learn what a rabbi thought about God, not just by what they said, but by how they behaved. One learned a theology of how to treat one's family by watching how your rabbi treated their family, or a theology of how to engage in the marketplace by watching how a rabbi engaged in the marketplace, or a theology of how to pray by how a rabbi prayed. Hence, the disciples' question to Jesus in Luke 11, teach us to pray, would be similar to teach us how to do what we see you doing. And of course, Jesus, who has been exemplifying all this time, begins with a series of examples of how not to pray. How we are formed into and by a community is a huge part of what it means to be disciples. However, many of us have lost touch with the rhythms and practices that were commonplace in the time of Jesus, as well as some of what has been commonplace for much of church history. It takes now an intentional work to engage in those ways or practices of relating to God and each other, those ways of worship. Community remains vital, but how we practice community and what we practice in community requires intentional work. This work must begin with our leadership in order that what we embody and exemplify might be an example truly worth following. Ultimately, we are all following Jesus, but we want to be able to say with the Apostle Paul, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." This example of Jesus and the humility to grow towards that is what should set apart leadership in the church and the leadership of Christians from any other type of leadership in the world. It's also why the shortcomings and failures of leadership in our church have been so heartbreaking. These shortcomings can't just be addressed on the surface. They need to be addressed at a formative level in our lives. With regards to formation, we can also be tempted to think that if we just knew more, we would be stronger disciples. We can come to believe that greater knowledge about God and His Word will cause us to become better followers of Him. Such an increase in knowledge is certainly an indispensable part of what it means to be a disciple and follow Jesus, but it's not everything. James K.A. Smith, in Imagining the Kingdom, writes, "If a Christian education is going to be holistic and formative, it needs to attend to much more than the intellect, which is why I emphasize that there is a unique understanding that is carried in Christian practices, particularly the practices of Christian worship. It is in such practices that our love is trained, disciplined, shaped, and formed." What he is suggesting is that it is the practices we engage in that help form who we are in ways that affect how we respond. We need more than knowledge. We need a second nature response that is kingdom-oriented. Smith goes on to suggest that the world is already at work shaping us in a secular liturgy, forming our way of thinking about who we are and what we need and what happiness and fulfillment looks like through 1,000 different avenues capturing our imagination. We need intentional work to be captured instead by the ways and imaginings of His kingdom. Romans 12:2 puts it like this: "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." This is connected to how N.T. Wright talks about virtue and writes in After You Believe, virtue is what happens when wise and courageous choices have become second nature, not first nature as though they happen naturally, rather a second order level of naturalness. Like an acquired taste, such choices and actions, which started off being practiced with difficulty, ended up being, yes, second nature. James Clear in Atomic Habits says, ultimately your habits matter because they help you become the type of person you wish to be. They are the channel through which you develop your deepest beliefs about yourself. What I'm trying to say is that I believe we need to greatly strengthen the work of discipleship and spiritual formation in our church by engaging more intentionally with practices of worship, including and going beyond the powerful worship we encounter in church when we gather. One of the great challenges of the pandemic was that in not gathering together, many of us lost the only worship practice in which we had regularly engaged, and may have since lost some of our capacity for worship overall. I pray we would regain that capacity, and not just to the extent to which it once burned most bright in our lives, but that it would burn more brightly than ever. I pray these aspects of discipleship won't be set at odds with one another, but that we will hold strong to the power of community and formation, as well as the importance of growing in knowledge, while engaging in the crucial value of practices that help us become and desire to become who God reveals we are. I pray that corporate and private practices might grow us and allow us to more powerfully experience God's Spirit and presence and transformation. You might be aware that as a staff, we recently completed the first subject in a postgraduate course on well-being, focused on emotions. We wanted to better understand what the current research is saying about well-being, so we are better equipped to lead people and create cultures that will produce health, while staying true to what the Bible teaches us about how to find real life. What was astounding to us during the course was to discover the ways in which so many ancient Christian disciplines reflect practices that we now understand to produce growth in emotional health and well-being. EHR and its sister course, EHS, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, have been a treasure trove of such experiences and were originally put together and road tested right here in New York City. We're excited to start making these courses available for our church. Everything in me wants to move fast and have things done yesterday, but implementing some of these things has taken and is going to take time. Pete and Jerry would often say to me, slow down, which just made me want to speed up even more. But I understand what they are saying. If we really want these practices to change us as a community, then they have to be present in the leadership. We have to be engaging with them and living them out ourselves. Now, they are still relatively new for many of us, and we will always certainly need to grow and change in these areas. Progress, not perfection, is the motto. But we have given and are giving focus and time to put them into practice. We have sown time into taking our staff through the EHR course, and in the middle of the year, we took over 70 people from our church through the course as well. The exciting thing is that we are in the midst of running the course right now with over 150 people involved across all 3 campuses. Over time, I believe that engaging in the practices that these courses help facilitate will help form our culture in a variety of ways. I believe it will help us establish healthy boundaries, work lovingly through conflict, live with more joy, and draw closer to God. I'm still far from perfect in all of these areas, as I'm sure anyone who knows me could tell you. But I'm progressing, and I pray we all will. I still feel born for this, as I know many of you do. We find ourselves in a moment of history where there is a tangible hunger around us for real spirituality, a longing for purpose, as well as God's heart that people would know His incredible love for them. All these things compel me to believe that this is a pivotal time for the church and for such a time as this moment for our church. As we strengthen our foundations in the area of formation, my prayer is that we would grow through challenge, stay tender towards God and people, and remain passionate about His call on our lives. With love, Krishan.